All right, so what we'll do now is we're going to move a little bit away from SQL into something called ActiveRecord. Now, yeah, let's just dive right into it. All right, so ActiveRecord. Basically, ActiveRecord is what's called an object relational mapping, or an ORM. And what this does is it's a library that essentially just goes into SQL and it's basically a library that translates SQL into Ruby code for you. Or when you type Ruby code, it'll translate it into SQL and you can query a database like that. So usually you have queries that look a little something like this. Insert into students first name, last name, date of birth, and the values of first name, last name, and date of birth is James Cube from 4973. This is how you would usually write inside of SQL. This is happening what's underneath the hood. What ActiveRecord does, what all object relational maps do, is that it looks a little something like this now. You can just write Ruby. So you can create a new student, and if everything is set up correctly, you can just pass in first name is James, last name is Cube, and this is the new date of birth. I'm going to create a new date object, which is 1973-49, and then I could just do .save. And then it'll save into the database. So you can write SQL code that looks like this, and it's important. It's really important that you know SQL. Or you can write ActiveRecord for basic things like this. Instead of inserting it into knowing the table names and all this stuff, and knowing every exact syntax, which is still important. Basically, developers have abstracted it away so that the only way you talk to the database is like this. Again, what happens after? What do you think happens right after student.save? What do you think happens here? It's not a trick question. It's very. It saves it to the database. Yeah. So what happens after you call student.save is this. Again, you're just calling this code, and then .save actually just does this piece of code right here. It's just an abstraction. There's no magic. Like, it may seem like it's magic that you don't have to write code like this, but someone underneath the hood said, okay, .save will give me the .save will just give me this. It's just an abstraction. It's kind of like saying, what's a good analogy for this one? Okay, so before it was seen as lazy if you were to go have let's talk about restaurants, since we were on the thing of restaurants this morning. So you order from a restaurant, you're lazy because you ordered from a restaurant, and then you walk to the restaurant, you pick up your food, and you go home. That's what 1.0 was. Then they invented delivery. So you're lazy, you don't want to cook, you call up, okay, I'd like to have this delivered. Someone else is walking to your to your apartment now. It's not magic, right? Even though it seems like magic. Now I can actually just order something online, and then 45 minutes later it shows up at my doorstep. That seems like magic, but it's not. It's just an abstraction. Someone still needs to make the food. Someone still needs to pick it up, and someone still needs to walk it back. Whether it's you or somebody else, it's the same thing happening underneath the hood. Somebody needs to pick up the food from the restaurant and bring it to your house. Same thing with an ActiveRecord here. You can either write SQL just like this, or you can write ActiveRecord code. One or the other, they both do the exact same thing. One's a little easier than the other one. It's easy for me to sit at my house watching television and then order a pizza, and then the pizza shows up 45 minutes later. But it's underneath the hood, it's the same thing that's happening.
Can you go back to the Ruby one? So date.new, is that necessary because of the data type?
Yep.
Okay.
Yeah. So this is where object orientation really comes into play. Up to this point, you're like, okay, so an object like a military recruit has a first name, last name, date of birth. Like, who cares? Like, what am I going to do with that particular piece of information? Now the classes are going to associate 100% with the database. So it's like, in this case, the database is going to have a students table with first name, last name, and date of birth. In my case, right here, like when I initialize a new one, it's all these attributes are the columns inside your database, and then those need to match up perfectly, and then you can call .save on it.
If you did students.new or student.new,
Yep.
why do you need date.new too? Like, shouldn't that be a new one anyway?
Sure. So like when you save a date into a database, like are you saving it as a string or are you saving it as an actual date? An actual date. So what happens is, like, that's a great question. Let's just take a look at it real quick. If I pass it in as like 1990 or something like that, it's being saved as a string, correct? So if I pass it in as a string and I just save it directly, I'm going to break the database is going to be angry with me because it's expecting an actual date and not a string. So I need to convert this thing into a date. So if I just do date.new of this, that doesn't work. Let's go back over here. 1973-49. This is an actual date object. Like, so it changes from a string, just like when you're entering it, and changes it actually into a date object, which is what the database wants.
Okay, got it.
That's all.
So that's what he understood in one question when he said that's just
Yes.
Yeah.
But it's a good thing that you asked the clarifying question, because I'm sure you're not the only person with that same question. All right, so again, after you call student.save, nothing magical happens. It just translates, it just runs this particular code. Student.save equals all of this stuff.
So
It's just an
how does
abstraction,
it
it's
know
not magic.
what database? Because the student is the table name. So how does it know what database?
So when you deal with a particular, when you deal with like one particular application, so think about Amazon. Amazon is not one giant database. That would be way too dangerous. They probably have 1,000 databases. Each one of them does one specific thing, and that one specific thing relates to whatever part of the business they're working on. So there might be a database just for credit cards, just for orders, and that your particular app is going to connect to one database only. So if you want to read a little bit more about the library, you can just go on like Google and look up ActiveRecord. Somebody wrote this code. Like, you can see what's happening underneath the hood. There's nothing proprietary or secret. So that's why it's open source software. You can read like how they did it. So there's a few new things now. I know that yesterday we just covered how to name our tables and things like that. And when we talk, we're going to translate it out the other way. So if we're talking about keeping many orders in a database or many people in a database, the table names are going to be called persons and orders. But when you go back to object-oriented programming, it's going to be singular and capital. So it's going to be person and order. And this is that object-oriented code that we've been doing so far. Apple tree, apple orchard, like singular, and we create many of those. The columns, like first name and last name inside of your database, are just going to be your instance variables. Remember, like when we did military recruit.new, first name, last name, date of birth, branch of service, pay grade, and all that kind of stuff. Those would all be columns on your table, and they're instance variables on inside of your class. And then there's also queries, like your select, insert, update, and delete. Like if you were to do select star from students where ID equals 2, this is obviously, I'm selecting everything from the students table where the ID number is going to equal 2. The equivalent of that is just this, student.findByID2. It's a little bit less code to type. It has its own particular syntax, but hopefully this makes it a little bit easier to write SQL code using Ruby. Just some things to think about. It's obviously not going to apply to you right now, but as you start using ActiveRecord today, keep in mind, like, where does Ruby end? Like when I call, like I'm writing all this Ruby code, like where does it stop and where does SQL begin? When does it actually get translated into SQL? And when you're talking about Ruby and like Rails and ActiveRecord, like what should you be doing in SQL and what should you be doing in ActiveRecord? For small things like select star from students where ID is equal to 2, that's totally fine. You can just use student.findBy2. But I had a boss who, at my second development job, who says, like, I refuse to let any of my developers write actual ActiveRecord code. You have to write SQL every single time. I said, why do I have to do that? He goes, because in order to get better overall, like, you may not use Rails, you may not use ActiveRecord, you may be in JavaScript or something like that. Like, you still, but SQL is forever, but not necessarily, you won't necessarily be using this particular syntax forever. But for basic things like this, go ahead and use it. And then,
sorry, can you actually write SQL in Ruby code then?
yes. Most of the time you don't need to, because ActiveRecord does it, but you can write SQL inside of Ruby code. So as you are going through today's stuff, and I have one more slide deck to go through, which will help out. All of these have really well-written tests, and your whole job is to make the test pass. You're going to Google a lot of stuff today, and your job is just to make the test pass. As you're debugging things and getting really, really frustrated, I do remember this was the day that Bravo Platoon went to Google, and then they were just like so angry for the afternoon. They're like, I have 47 failures coming up. Like, why? Like, now I have 46 failures. Thanks, John. You know, as you are getting frustrated and you're starting to debug through things, use debugging tools. Like, use pry. If you don't know what the result is that's coming out, just look up what pry is. Open your database console, print out any SQL statements, you know, and just use the tests to help guide you along. I have one last deck that will hopefully clear up a few things before we kind of get started with today's stuff. Okay. So again, not again. So Rails, Ruby on Rails is an open source framework. And a framework is just thousands of lines of Ruby code that someone wrote to make your life as a developer much easier. It was created as a result of DHH, who was working at a company called Basecamp. He was writing the same thing in PHP over and over again, like for all of his clients. Every client wanted something to create, read, update, and destroy records. It's called a CRUD app, and we'll cover that in 3 weeks. But it was basically every single app, like if you name any single app on the web, every single one has the ability to create something, read something, update, and delete something. Amazon, you're able to create, read, update, and delete products. Twitter, you can create, read, you can't update, but you can also delete your tweets. You know, like every single picture that you put up, you can create it, you can look at it, you can update it if you need to, and you can delete it if you need to. So when DHH was creating Rails, he's kind of like, I'm doing the same thing over and over. I want to create a new framework that does all of this for me, so I don't have to keep doing this manual labor over and over again. I want to be lazy. So he created Rails, and Rails underneath the hood, like I said, it's a framework, which means thousands of lines of Ruby code that someone wrote ahead of time. And part of those 1,000 lines of code are different libraries, things to query the database so I don't have to write SQL, things to send out emails so I don't have to write thousands of lines to send out emails. Now, inside of Rails 5, you have the ability to actually just put in chat message functionality with just like 10 minutes of setup. Those are the thousands of lines of code that someone wrote ahead of time to make your life a little bit easier. ActiveRecord is one of those libraries that makes up Rails, and it's Ruby's object relational mapping ORM tool. It's the way that we can connect to the database without actually having to use SQL. So we'll cover a few things: ORMs, ActiveRecord queries, validations, and associations. So ORM, you're going to most likely be tested on what an ORM is. It stands for object relational mapping. And you can just think of it as two, like that's a fancy way of saying it does two things. One, connects your Ruby classes to your database. If you have a if you have an order class, like singular, a capitalized order class, then you have an orders table. If you have a person, class person, then you have a people table. If you have a restaurant, singular class, then you have a restaurants table. It's a way just to connect your particular classes to your database. And on top of that, it also helps you not have to write actual SQL. You can basically say like student.find one, and then you can find the first student rather than select star from students where ID is equal to 1. Student.find one is much faster to write than all of that SQL. That's a basic rundown on an ORM. So ActiveRecord in particular is Ruby's ORM. There's many different ORMs. This is the issue of why like you don't want to get married to one particular ORM and why SQL is important. Java has an ORM called Hibernate. If you've ever written Java code, you may have used Hibernate. JavaScript has one called Sequelize. Python has one called Django ORM. Like there are many different ORMs that you can use to connect with the database, and all of them have their own specific like intricacies and things like that. Ours is called ActiveRecord, but they all operate similarly. I'm using the language to connect to the database, so I don't actually have to write actual SQL. So here are some queries that you may see in SQL. Select everything from posts. Select everything from posts where the ID is equal to 15. Select everything from posts joined to authors on these particular things where the author ID is equal to 20. Like these are some things that you may see inside of SQL. The equivalent of all those things is just this. Post.all. Give me all the posts. So instead of typing select star from posts, I just do post.all. If I want to find the 15th thing in the post table, I just do post.find15 instead of select star from post where ID is equal to 15. Underneath the hood, like this is what's being executed, but the thing that you actually type is this. And then post.joins author where ID is equal to 20 is much nicer than just typing all of this code out.
Wait, go back to the
Sure.
what that equals.
Again, it's one of those things where it's like, do I really want to spend all day typing this giant join statement out, or can I just do .joins authors? So that's the power behind using like an ORM. But underneath the hood, this .joins authors is actually just running this code. Another concept you're going to have to hit today is something called validations. So again, like I said yesterday, you have to assume as a web developer that every single person using your site, using your service, is going to try to attack your website. So yeah, everyone is trying to attack your website and you want to protect your website. I can tell you that I met this one person who was working as a lawyer for Sears, the Sears Corporation in Hoffman Estates. And he says, we get sued every single day. Every single day, every hour of the day, we're getting sued. And my team's job is to go through each one of those things and to make sure that if they're bogus claims, we can just throw it away, or like if they're real, then we start building a case against them. But a large company like Sears and Chase Bank, Amazon, they have lawsuits coming in left and right. They have a team of lawyers to prevent anything from happening to them. Similarly, your website is going to get attacked every second of every day. You can, like, whether it's a belligerent attack, like someone's actually trying to steal something, or it's just kind of like it's being attacked because some people just don't know any better. Like it's like they're just bad users or something like that. Like you have to protect your website at all costs. So from the very front end, what you see on the screen, like if I were to try to fill out a phone number with ABCD, or if I were to try a social security number with like bang symbols and question marks and things like that, you need to protect yourself. So it starts from the front end, the HTML and the CSS and the JavaScript. Starting from the form, you shouldn't accept things like letters for social security numbers. You shouldn't be accepting special characters for birthdays or something like that. So you start from there. Then it passes into what's called the controller layer, which you don't need to know yet. And then it gets into the database. It gets the model, and then it gets to the database. So there are 4 layers of protection that you have to go through in order to save something terrible into the database. The database, once it's there, it's there. You could do a ton of damage once you get into the database at that point. So what people end up doing is they create something called ActiveRecord validations. So let's say I have a basketball player. If I have a class basketball player, what is my table name going to be called?
Basketball players.
Yeah, basketball players, all lowercase, snake-cased with an S at the end. I want to, before I save anything in, like once it gets to the ActiveRecord layer, before it gets saved into the database, I wanted to validate a few things. One, I want to make sure that perhaps like a name is there. Like, so I'm going to validate that the basketball player has a name and that presence is true. Like it's present. It's not null. When they enter a biography, I don't want a super long biography. I just want one where the length is going to be 500 characters. So it's like the number of games that you play. I only want an integer. Like I don't want you to type in the number, the letter TWO. I just want the number 2. Or something like the uniqueness of an email address. If I have one particular basketball player, which is like, Michael Jordan at Bulls.com, I don't want another person signing up with that same email address of Michael Jordan at Bulls.com. So validations are important to protect your database from receiving any sort of bad information. Associations. Associations. Let's start with this. Every single SQL table is a plural noun. Basketball players, restaurants, menu items, orders, and then every single class that correlates and will inherit from active record base like we saw here, it's going to be singular, like a class student is going to inherit from active record base. When you don't have this line right here, this less than active record base, it just becomes what's called a poro, a plain old Ruby object. It doesn't have any extra functionality. All the stuff that we've been writing so far has no extra functionality. But by this one tiny little inheriting from active record base, I get a whole bunch of extra stuff. Like I have all of these, like the ability to do validations. I have the ability to do associations. I have the ability to connect to a database here. Without this less than active record base, like I don't have any of that functionality. If I just have class student, nothing happens. I can't save it into a database. The moment I do class student inherit from active record base, all of the power of active record base comes into the student here.
So that's like the equivalent of like CSV.read or whatever, like linking it to something bigger than itself. Like that's just how we do it.
Yes. Yeah.
So just memorize.
Mm-hmm.
What are those double colons?
So remember when we were doing things with modules, like namespacing the modules, like a planet : Earth, like it would be class Earth surrounded by module planet. So it's basically the same thing here. So there's a module called active record, and inside there's a class called base.
So is there other classes you can use?
Yes.
Other than base?
Yeah. But 99.9% of the time you're going to be using active record base. So the associations essentially, like how do you data model your database? So we did that this morning with restaurants and menu items and order items and things like that. Since we're going to start that today, there's three associations that we're going to be dealing with: belongs to, has many, and has many through. So before we get started, let's do one quick exercise together, and then hopefully that will be of some use. Let's grab associations here. Or should I just make you jump into it?
Now we should go over it.
I'm debating. Yeah, let's do one together. All right, I'm going to create just a new one for us so that I'm not giving anything away. So I'm going to open Reveal and Finder. Give me any site.
Like a website?
Yeah, the one that you use on a regular basis.
Wikipedia.
I remember what I said about you started off with one thing, like one file. Now you have a lot more. Let's kind of go over what we've got here. All right. So we have inside of active record associations, you have 4 different challenges: Amazon, IMDb, Medium, and Uber Eats. And we just created one called Wikipedia just to get ourselves started. Now let's kind of like see what we've got here. So we have many different folders. I'm going to open them up one by one, starting at the bottom. I don't need test. Let's kind of see what we've got. So first thing we have is a gem file. So remember we were doing like gem install RSpec, gem install CSV, gem install Rubocop, gem install, like you needed to do that over and over again, and it sucks because every single time. And especially as your things get larger, right now we're already using we're using 6 gems here: RSpec, Postgres, Rake, ActiveRecord migrations, database cleaner. Like we're using all these different gems. So when you know that your app is going to require many different gems, you throw everything in the gem file like this, and I just run bundle install. So let me see where we are at. So cd into Wikipedia. I'm just going to run bundle install. What bundle install does is it goes through every single one of the gems that you have in there, and if it doesn't exist, it will turn green, and then it will install it for you. So you can kind of see like all of these gems, like my computer doesn't really have a super updated copy of it, so it's updating it for me. So this is installing all the things that you need in order to run your app. Gem file lock is basically just it's saving like which version is working right now, so that when you install it, it's going to match up with these particular version. So you can kind of see underneath the hood of these 6 gems is actually all these other gems. So like I don't know what Arel is, but I need 8.0.0 of Arel in order to run this. I need a Nokogiri, anything greater than or equal to version 1.5.9. The spec is where you write all of your tests. Under DB here, and you'll see this as you start, like this is the very last thing in this is the very last assignment for today. Under DB, there's a migrate folder, and you can kind of see one gigantic mess of stuff here. My file looks like this right now, and it looks kind of gross, but this is the way that it's broken up: year, month, date, hour, minute, second, the timestamp. It's literally just like when was this created. So this one was created on January 20th of 2017 at 9:35 p.m. So this is when this particular file was created. This is where you're going to write all of the code to create your database. And then these models here under app models, this refers to one particular class in your one particular table inside of your database. I don't think it's actually that good for me to go through this now because you actually don't have any concept of what I'm talking about. So I think I will cover this tomorrow morning and let you get started on the challenges so that you at least have some understanding of what I'm talking about, because you haven't seen this yet. So I think I'll cover this again tomorrow morning and not today. There are 4 challenges for today. They're all pretty difficult. There are 3 challenges for today, and they're pretty difficult. You have 2 days to finish these. So I understand the likelihood of anybody finishing all 3 challenges today is very, very low, and I wouldn't rush. So you have active record queries. So you're going to kind of read through this and try to pass all the tests. I think there's like 45 of them. You're basically going to fail the test, find the code that works online, put it in your code base, and then continue moving down the line so you understand what queries are available to you via Active Record. The second one is Active Record validations. We're going to say like, okay, like what do I need to do in order to save stuff to my database without having huge blow up issues? And then finally, we have active record associations, which it's fun. It's fun. I'll just say it's fun. It's very difficult, but it's fun. So today's a pairing day. So pair up with anyone that you'd like. I think everyone has met with everyone at this point. If you haven't, just let me know, and then we'll pair you up. But in person, you can go with remote if you want to. You can stick with in person if you'd like. But yeah, that's all we have for today. Hopefully you have a better understanding of SQL, and you'll have a appreciation for ActiveRecord pretty soon. Any questions?
Don't want John, but
Yep.
It can wait. Like we could do it after.
Okay.
Like it's up to you.
I'm going to stop recording here.